Some stories begin quietly, but not this one. This one starts on a warm September afternoon, in a small chapel tucked behind a line of maple trees, where a bride in a white lace gown lifted her foot and kicked the man she had promised to love forever, right in front of his closest friends. And what he did next didn't just silence the room, it broke something inside her that no apology could mend. You may think you've heard every kind of wedding disaster, but there was something different about this moment, something that made grown men freeze and left the best man staring in disbelief. Stay with me, because what unfolded after that single, shocking kick would unravel secrets none of them expected, and take the couple down a path that changed their lives in ways they never saw coming. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. But before we reach that moment, let me ask you something. What could push a bride, someone who spent months planning every delicate detail of her perfect day, to lash out at the man waiting at the end of the aisle? Was it nerves? Humiliation? A buried truth finally clawing its way to the surface? And what could he possibly do afterward that would leave her in tears? Today, we explore not only what happened, but why it happened. We look into who they were before that moment, what they carried into their marriage, and what broke beneath the surface long before anyone noticed. And as you listen, I want you to ask yourself, if you had been standing in that chapel, would you have judged her, or would you have understood her? Stay with me, because the truth behind this wedding will test everything you think you know about love, pride, and the choices we regret only when it's too late. To understand that moment in the chapel, we must step back months before the wedding, back to when Emily Carter first met David Lancaster at a community fundraiser in Cedar Falls. Emily was the kind of woman people described as steady, someone who kept her promises, showed up early, and believed deeply in the quiet goodness of people. David, on the other hand, carried a gentleness that made strangers feel safe around him, but behind that calm exterior was a man who struggled to speak up for himself. They connected instantly, not with fireworks, but with something slower and far more meaningful, relief. Both had been through difficult relationships in their past, relationships that left them cautious, almost guarded. And maybe that's why, in those early months, they each tried so hard not to disappoint the other, even when small misunderstandings surfaced. Looking back, that desire to avoid conflict planted the very seeds that would one day grow into something neither of them could control. Emily had always imagined her wedding as a simple gathering, filled with laughter and the kind of warmth that made people feel like family. But as planning went on, she began to feel pressure she never expected. Her mother insisted on adding traditions Emily didn't care for, and David's friends, especially his childhood buddy Mark, were overly involved, offering opinions on everything from the venue to the color of napkins. David didn't push back, because he didn't like making anyone uncomfortable. Emily didn't push back either, because she didn't want to be seen as difficult. And though they loved each other, neither of them noticed how often they were both swallowing their true feelings. If you've ever been in a relationship like that, where silence becomes a habit, maybe you understand how dangerous that can be. Little unspoken frustrations add up, becoming heavier with every passing day. There was one moment, about 2 months before the wedding, that should have been a warning sign, one that Emily remembered all too well. She and David were meeting with the pastor when Mark barged into the room, cracking jokes and nudging David as if they were still teenagers. When Emily gently suggested they finish the meeting alone, Mark laughed and said, "Relax, Em, it's not that serious." David chuckled nervously and didn't say anything. It wasn't a big scene, nothing dramatic, but Emily felt something twist inside her. She wondered why David couldn't set boundaries, or why he didn't see how uncomfortable it made her. Still, she told herself it wasn't worth an argument. Many people do that, don't they? They convince themselves that letting things go is the mature choice. But sometimes letting things go means letting resentment grow roots where love is supposed to bloom. On the night before the wedding, Emily couldn't sleep. She lay awake replaying every small moment she had ignored, the jokes that stung more than they should have, the times David stayed quiet when she needed him to speak, the subtle way his friends treated her like she was marrying into their group rather than building a new family with her husband. She told herself she was just nervous, that every bride felt this way before saying, "I do." But beneath that nervousness was something deeper, a fear that she and David weren't stepping into marriage as partners, but as two people pretending everything was fine. When morning came, she forced a smile, put on the dress she had dreamed about for years, and told herself she could handle anything as long as David was by her side. She didn't know yet that within hours, everything she'd been holding inside would erupt in front of everyone they loved. The ceremony began like any other: soft music, whispered excitement, the rustle of dresses as guests settled into their seats. Emily walked slowly down the aisle, her bouquet trembling ever so slightly in her hands. She saw David waiting for her, looking both nervous and relieved, as if her presence alone eased something inside him. But beside him stood Mark, grinning broadly, nudging David with his elbow in a way that felt painfully out of place on such a tender day. Emily noticed it immediately, the same behavior that had unsettled her before. And when she reached the altar, she heard Mark mutter something under his breath, a joke meant only for David. She didn't catch every word, but she caught enough to feel the sting, something mocking the way she walked, something meant to be funny but deeply disrespectful. She inhaled sharply, hoping David would say something, anything, to show he understood the weight of the moment. But David didn't. Instead, he let out a quiet laugh, the kind people use when they're too afraid to make things awkward. And in that instant, something inside Emily cracked, not because of the joke itself, but because she realized she had been waiting for him to stand up for her for months. She had ignored the small hurts, silenced her own discomfort, convinced herself love meant patience. But now, standing at the altar on what was supposed to be the happiest day of her life, she felt exposed, foolish, and painfully alone. When the pastor invited them to join hands, Emily hesitated. David frowned slightly, confused, but before he could speak, Mark leaned in again and whispered another comment, this time loud enough for Emily to hear the whole thing. It wasn't vulgar, but it was belittling, reducing her to a punchline on her own wedding day. And this time, she couldn't swallow it. Without thinking, guided purely by months of suppressed hurt, Emily stepped back and kicked David in the shin. Not hard enough to injure him, but hard enough to make the room fall into stunned silence. Gasps rippled through the chapel. Chairs shifted. Someone dropped their program. David stumbled slightly, more shocked than hurt, staring at Emily as if he didn't recognize her. She felt her heart pounding against her ribs, her breath coming in short, panicked bursts. She hadn't planned it, she wasn't even the type to raise her voice, let alone lash out physically. But in that moment, it was the only way she knew to break the pattern that had swallowed her voice for so long. She expected David to get angry, or embarrassed, or to walk away. But what he did next, in front of everyone, was something she would never forget. He knelt. Not in a dramatic, romantic way, but slowly, carefully, like he understood she was standing on the very edge of something fragile. His friends were frozen. Mark's grin vanished. The pastor looked unsure if he should intervene. But David didn't look at any of them. He looked only at Emily, his eyes steady, soft, and filled with a kind of sadness she had never seen in him before. In a voice barely louder than a whisper, he said, "I'm sorry." Not the kind of apology a man gives to calm things down, but the kind that acknowledges years of unspoken hurt. The kind that breaks a heart because it comes too late. Emily felt her throat tighten as tears blurred her vision, and for the first time that day, she felt truly seen, yet painfully aware of how much they had left unresolved. As you listen to this moment, ask yourself, if you were standing in that chapel, what would you have felt? Sympathy? Confusion? Or recognition of your own silent struggles? The chapel sat in thick, uncomfortable silence as Emily and David stood facing each other, surrounded by people who suddenly didn't know where to look. Emily's breath trembled as she tried to make sense of what she had just done. Her foot still tingled from the kick, and shame flooded her in a slow, heavy wave. She hadn't come here to humiliate him. She came here to start a life with him. But months of swallowed frustration had erupted in the worst possible moment. David slowly rose to his feet, brushing dust from his pant leg as if buying himself time. His eyes never left hers. "We need a minute," he said gently, surprising everyone with the steadiness in his voice. The pastor nodded awkwardly, and guests parted as the couple stepped aside into a small side room. Emily felt every step like a weight dragging her chest down, unsure whether she was walking toward reconciliation or the end of everything. Inside the small room, the door clicked shut behind them. The sound was soft, but in Emily's ears, it felt final. David didn't speak right away. He leaned against the wall, running a hand through his hair the way he always did when he was overwhelmed. Emily stared at her trembling hands, unable to lift her eyes. "I didn't mean to. I don't know why I did that," she whispered. But she did know. And he did too. David sighed, a long, tired breath that seemed to come from years of holding things in. I know I should have stopped him. I know I should have stepped in earlier. I've failed you in ways I didn't want to see." His voice cracked slightly, and for the first time, Emily saw the depth of his regret. It wasn't anger she feared anymore, it was the realization that they had both been hurting long before this moment. But just as it seemed they might find a path forward, a knock sounded at the door. It was Mark's voice, loud, irritated, and unmistakably defensive. "Dave, come on, man. Are we seriously doing this? She kicked you. We can still salvage the day, just tell her to calm down." His words sliced through the air, each one dismissing Emily as if she weren't even a person with feelings, as if her hurt was just an inconvenience. David stiffened, and Emily felt her chest tighten with fresh pain. She waited, hoping he would finally speak up, not to defend her actions, but to defend her dignity. Seconds passed. Mark knocked again, impatient. Emily turned toward David, her voice barely audible. "This is why I broke today. Because he always talks over me. Because you never tell him no. Because I feel alone even when you're standing right there." Her eyes glistened, not with anger, but with heartbreak. David closed his eyes, and for the first time since she had met him, Emily saw something shift within him. A quiet resolve. A man tired of disappointing the person he loved. He walked to the door, opened it just enough to see Mark, and said in a steady voice Emily had never heard from him before, "Go back inside. We need space. And you don't get to talk about her like that ever again." Mark blinked in shock, taken aback by the rare firmness. "Seriously? You're choosing her over your friends?" David didn't hesitate. "I'm choosing my future." And with that, he closed the door. Emily covered her mouth with her hands as tears slipped down her cheeks. She had waited so long to hear him set that boundary, not for her pride, but for their partnership. The moment felt like a small victory, but also a painful reminder of how long they had both been avoiding the truth. And as they stood there in that quiet room, the real question formed between them: could they still save this day, or had the damage already gone too far? Before we finish, take a moment and reflect. What would you have done in Emily's place? And in David's? Could you have had the courage to face the truth, or would silence have won again? Share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear where you're watching from and how this story resonates with your own life. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming stories, each one designed to touch your heart and challenge the way you think about love, relationships, and the choices we make when life refuses to go as planned.